All right. Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today. Today we have Jodi Healy with us talking about perennial identification, plant names, and why they are important. Jodi currently works independently, providing horticultural services. Currently, she instructs courses at the University of Guelph and Mohawk College, delivers seminars at Landscape Ontario, and is working on her master's degree at Vancouver Island University. Jodi is a graduate of the Bachelor of Science Plant Biology at the University of Guelph and has spent 10 years working at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Burlington. Here she has worked as the gardens manager, curator of the annual display, and plant records coordinator, allowing her to contribute to many aspects of the horticultural department. She also has an experience with interior landscaping, exterior landscaping, and floral design, and has been a judge for the Monarch Awards. She is an avid organic gardener. And before we get started, just a few brief housekeeping notes. If you have questions, please do write them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. If your screen freezes, please hit the reconnect button at the top of the screen. And at the end of this session, we will be sending out a link with the replay to the webinar. Thank you so much. And now it's over to you, Jodi.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Looks like we have a great turnout on this rainy winter/spring morning. I'm glad so many people could make it out this morning. So this morning, thanks very much for that introduction, Carrie. I'm going to be talking about perennial identification. This is meant to be the first webinar in a series of webinars. So usually I would teach one on plant names and then we'd kind of get into more specific identification of different perennial species throughout the series. So today's lecture is going to focus mostly on plant names. We're going to talk about why they're important, kind of the difference between common names and scientific names. We're going to go into how they're assigned and their format. So talk about the International Code of Plant Names a little bit. Kind of a heavy, boring topic, but hopefully I'll make it interesting for you all. And we're going to talk about Latin, because as we know, scientific names are in Latin. We're going to talk about the meaning of some of those Latin terms used in plant names and a little bit about pronunciation. And finally, we're going to finish off with plant families and talk about how those are organized and how it's helpful to know your plant families to get started with identifying perennials. So that's the plan for this morning. Hopefully you guys all enjoy the morning. And as Carrie said, we'll answer questions at the end of the lecture this morning, because I find it hard to read and present at the same time. I was mentioning that to Carrie, that in the classroom, I don't have any problem answering questions during the lecture, but I find it really challenging to read and keep my focus on the lecture. All right, so let's get started here. So I'm gonna ask you guys to picture in your head a lily. So everybody can come up with what they think a lily looks like. So what did you guys come up with? I'm sure some of you came up with this. So this botanical name, the genus for this plant is Canna, common name Canna lily. It's kind of hard to get you guys to put your hands up how many thought of a canna lily, but I'll just trust that some of you thought of a canna lily this morning. I'm sure some of you came up with this plant, commonly known as the water lily. Genus for this one, Nymphaea. Some of you may have come up with this really showy bulb, the foxtail lily, genus name Eremiris. Some of you may have come up with this one, the torch lily, Nephophia, really showy perennial species. And I think this is the most popular one when I asked this question, a daylily. So many of you probably came up with Hemerocallis. And if any of you came up with any of those pictures we just looked at, I have to tell you that you're all wrong. From a scientific perspective, none of those are in the genus Lilium. A real lily is in the genus Lilium, and that is what we see pictured here. So this is a picture of a type of lily, an Asiatic lily. It is a bulb, and it is a true lily. So in the genus Lilium. And you can see here, this is another species in the genus Lilium, so kind of has the reflexed petals there, but still has the same kind of sexual parts sticking out of the flower there in the proper genus Lily. And this is an Easter lily. So those are actual lilies in the genus Lilium. And we refer to all of those species by the common name lily. However, it's just the common vernacular we use to refer to those plants because they all, for some reason, have maybe look similar to a proper lily, or maybe it's just something that has evolved because of culture over time. But we refer to all those plants as lily. But scientifically speaking, only one of them actually is. So another common name that applies to many, many different botanical species is the term daisy. So if you look here, we have the oxeye daisy, really anything that has this kind of floral structure with those small flowers in the middle and then the large kind of, they look like petals, but they're actually also small flowers around the outside of the flower. Anything that looks like that, we tend to give the common name daisy. But as you can see here, the species name for this is Buthalamum speciosum. And again, the Shasta daisy, a nice easy word to say. Again, that same floral structure where you can see the small flowers in the middle and the kind of showy flowers on the out edges of the flower. Totally different genus, Leucanthemum superbum cultivar Agladia. So you can see there that they look very similar. We call them all daisies, but the term daisy doesn't actually refer to any species. There isn't a botanical name that is a daisy. We call over 100 different species daisy in our common vernacular. So if you were to search for the word daisy on the Royal Horticultural Society's Plant Finder, which is one of the best search engines for number of species included, you can find over 100 results for the term daisy. So just in case you didn't get the point, I'm going to really drive this one home this morning. If you were to talk to someone in Scotland about a bluebell, they would probably start picturing Campanula rotundifolia. And if you were talking to someone about a bluebell in England, they would picture an entirely different plant, Hyacinthoides non-scripta would come to their mind. And in North America, you might be thinking of one of these different species. So penstemon, campanula, and pulmonium, we all commonly call as bluebell. So as you can kind of see here, really the only common characteristic between all of these plants is that they're blue. So common names tend to be something that is descriptive of the plant, that brings an image to our minds, is something that we can easily kind of say out loud and converse with our neighbors. We don't have to worry about how we're pronouncing it and sounding silly. It's a nice, easy language that we can use to communicate about plants. And we all do it. I do it as well, because it's something that is easy to do, and we can get our message across if we're all talking about our home gardens. Maybe it's a plant that we're looking at, and it's effective in that way. But it can also be pretty detrimental, especially when we're recommending plants in the garden center to people based on a common name. And this is kind of an example of how it can be detrimental. So if someone was to come in and ask you for a recommendation and you were to recommend the plant Bittersweet, what you're probably trying to recommend is Celastrus scandens, which is American bittersweet, a very nice woody vine, really attractive fruit, feeds the wildlife, really, really showy native plant, an excellent recommendation. However, what someone might end up buying, or maybe would end up getting and planting in their garden if they just went around looking for bittersweet, is the Oriental bittersweet. And this one is an invasive plant. As you can see in this picture here, it's growing to the very top of a tree, smothering all the vegetation, breaking some branches. It displaces our native bittersweet. And so if you were just to recommend bittersweet to someone and not tell them what species they're looking for, then they may end up with this plant. And the hard one with this is that if you were to try to tell them apart, Celastrus scandens needs to be in flower in order for you to do that, because Celastrus scandens has flowers at the very end of the branch, so at terminal flowers, whereas Celastrus orbiculaire has flowers at kind of all along the leaf, at every leaf axil. So it's really hard to tell them apart in a vegetative state early in the season, especially. But it's crucial, especially if you're recommending plantings for someone who has kind of a naturalized landscape where there's potential for this to escape into the wild. And the other plant that people could end up with, although I'm not sure this is entirely available in the trade, but bittersweet is the poisonous berry weed that we often see growing along hedgerows. So common names are not effective. They're not they're not a good way to communicate about plants. They can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people and a lot of different things in different regions. And it can be as simple as somewhere in southern Ontario might refer to a plant by a different common name than someone in northern Ontario. So they're very useful for us to communicate easily about plants, but they're not effective when we're talking about proper identification. So we really need botanical names to communicate effectively about plants. This goes for speaking to people in other countries scientifically about plants, but also in our own backyards. So let's get into what plant names are, how they're assigned, and just kind of how it all works. So the process of giving a plant a specific name that is a unique identifier for that species, the whole science around that is called taxonomy. So what taxonomy is someone called a taxonomist who studies plant names, makes decisions about where a plant will belong. Does it belong, first of all, is it a plant? So for example, us humans are in the kingdom Animalia, whereas all plants are in the kingdom Plantae. So that's kind of an easy distinction. You and I could decide looking at something, whether it was a plant or an animal or an insect, that type of thing. So that's very high level classification. But the study of taxonomy drills plants all the way down to species level, which is the unique identifier. So that is what we want to do that's the name we want to use when we're referring to one particular species. So my species would be Jodi Healy. That's my unique identifier. So it's the same thing for plants when we talk about their botanical name. So basically, the job of a taxonomist would be, say they traveled somewhere or someone sent them a specimen from maybe a rainforest that hadn't been explored very much. They would look at that plant, look at its morphology, look at its leaves, its flowers, its different characteristics about it, and decide where it belongs in this hierarchy here. So as you move down this chain to subkingdom, superdivision, division, class, order, family, genus, species, you get more specific. So all of the plants in a particular order have a certain characteristic that's similar, and then there's more similarities when you get down to the family level, and more similarities when you get, narrowing down the similarities when you get down to genus level, and then when you get to species, you're talking about a unique set of characteristics for that species. So there's two ways that this is done. Historically, it was all based on morphology. So it was all based on what the plant looks like. Does this plant have a similar leaf to this other plant? Does the female and male flower parts of this plant look like the female and male flower parts of this plant? Oftentimes it is based on reproductive morphology and not just leaves and stem and leaf arrangement. You kind of have to get down into those nitty-gritty details of a plant to find differences between them. But historically, it was all based on morphology. So things that people could see either with a naked eye or using a microscope. And that's the system that plants have been classified by since 1981. So you can see there's a lot of plants classified into a lot of orders and a lot of families. But more recently, 1998 is when this first started happening, was people started classifying plants using their DNA. So rather than just looking at a plant and deciding this has this leaf type, so it must belong to this plant family, scientists started actually coding the DNA of plants and placing them in groups according to their DNA structure. So it was in its infancy in 1998, but I think now in 2020, we're starting to see some of these changes trickle down into the industry. So a lot of the morphology aligned with the DNA structure of plants. So there, in many instances, nothing changed. So a lot of plants, if they had similar reproductive structures, they still belonged in the same family. But there were some big changes. For example, maples used to be in a family all their own when we talked about morphology-based taxonomy. But now they're in a family called Sapindaceae with horse chestnuts and a handful of other species. So they've been kind of grouped into a larger family based on their DNA code. Another example is asters. So I know I've started seeing Symphyotrichum in plant catalogs, and that's the new genus for aster because they've been able to separate them out a little farther based on their DNA structure. So this is obviously very high-level scientific, not very relevant to us on a day-to-day level when we're out in the garden. But the reason it's important to know is because you are going to start seeing name changes in plant catalogs, and you need to be aware that names can change. So, and this is why they change, because they're constantly evolving the classification of plants, finding out what family they belong in. So all of a sudden, you might see a common aster that you've planted for years in a catalog listed by the genus Symphotrichum. So it's just something to be aware of, that plant names do change. It can be very frustrating. It often takes a long time for those changes to trickle down to the nursery catalog level, but it does happen. And especially when you're dealing with native plants, it seems to happen. People seem to update plant names a little more often when they're selling a native species. And I think the reason for that is because there's concern about planting the right species in our wild spaces. So if any of you fell asleep, you can be assured that that's the heaviest part of the lecture this morning, and we're going to leave that part to the taxonomists. We're going to focus on the very low levels of that classification system. So when you're going out in the garden to identify plants, you really, I personally feel you have to start at the family level. That's the practical way for us to identify plants, is you start learning the characteristics of a particular plant family. And from there, you can find the resources you need to narrow it down to genus and species and get the name of the plant that you're looking to identify. So the rest of it is really just some information for you guys to kind of know where this all comes from and why it's important. So identifying plants is really not easy. You can see here flowering plants, which are the plants that we're most dealing with in our horticultural landscapes. There are 405 different families, 352,000 species. And we're just talking about species here. We're not even talking about cultivated varieties. So it's a lot of plants. So you can kind of imagine how much detail you have to get into to be able to tell 352,000 species apart from each other. You have to really get down into the details. So usually when I teach perennial identification, you do it by family and kind of learn the characteristics of a particular family. And then when you walk around your garden, you can say, hey, I think that's a mint or that's a legume. And from there, you can look at a list of plants in that particular family and figure out what species you're looking at. So let's talk about species names for a few minutes. There are a lot of rules around how we write botanical names, and these are all governed by the International Code of Plant Names, botanical nomenclature, the proper way to say it there. And it's a binary system. So you can see here it's made up of two parts, the binomial name, the genus, and the specific epithet, and together we call those a species. So this system has been used for a long time to name not only plants, but all living organisms. Dates way back, and you can see there 1707 to 1778 is when Carl Linnaeus was alive naming plants. He was the first person to start applying this system of plant names to plants, and it really stuck, obviously, since we're using it how many years later. So you can see an example there, Baptisia australis. So that is known as the species name, made up of a genus and a specific epithet. So the genus would apply to a larger number of plants. This species applies to a single plant. So the example there, Baptisia australis, was a wild species. So a wild species is something that we find in our natural landscapes. You can see just a little bit about formatting. The first letter is always capitalized in a genus, and the rest of the word is all lowercase, and the entire species name is italicized. So if you're looking at a plant name and you see it all lowercase, all italicized, you're looking at a wild species. Sometimes you will find little abbreviations within that, and they can be forma, subspecies, or variety. And what these are natural variations of that species. So a good example is if you were to go on a wildflower walk and see some red trilliums. Those are not a separate species. They are just a variation of the trillium. So they would be a forma of the wild species of trillium. So they're still a wild species, but just kind of a natural variant. So they occur naturally without any intervention from us. So the way to tell when you're looking at a plant catalog if you're looking at something that is a cultivated variety or a wild species is by looking at the name and seeing that it is all lowercase italicized. Cultivated plants are a little different. So cultivated varieties are things that humans have created. So they're still persistent under cultivation, so they're reliable. We can go buy an echinacea powwow wild berry and every time get the same plant, identify the same characteristics about that plant. But it is not something that occurs naturally in the wild. So you wouldn't walk in a nature walk and find a powwow wild berry growing in the woods. It's something that we have created, and cultivars are created in lots of different ways. Sometimes they just happen by accident and someone will select that and propagate it. Sometimes they are actually hybridized with other species. Sometimes they're just, sometimes they actually manipulate the plant cells with chemicals to try and come up with crazy new cultivars. There's lots of different ways that cultivars are created, but it's always a result of humans interfering and trying to create something a little different than we see in the wild. When you see a cultivar name in a plant catalog, you should see these single quotations around that cultivar name. So you will see the species name. So Picea abies is an example of a species name that you would see in a plant catalog, a wild species. But when you see Nana after it, in those single quotations, you know that you're looking at a cultivated variety. So most of the plants that we're using in the horticultural industry are cultivated varieties. According to the Code of Plant Names, you should have the species italicized, and you should see the cultivar name not italicized. And it depends on what list of plants you're looking at, what catalog, how much importance they put on writing the plant names according to the code. But this is the proper way to write a cultivated plant name. So you should always be able to tell if you're looking at a native species or a cultivated variety by the cultivar name and these single quotations. Now, this is important for us to know, especially with all the interest in native plants today. It's good to be able to tell the difference between a cultivated variety and a native species. For lots of reasons, we want to be planting native species in our native habitats and not cultivated varieties. For a couple reasons, there's often concern that mixing in new genes into a native population can cause problems. There's a lot of studies being done on whether some of the cultivated varieties have the same, are able to supply nectar to native pollinators and that type of thing. So there can be subtle differences in our cultivated varieties that are not going to make them a valuable part of our natural ecosystems. But there's a lot of debate about that. So it's not cut and dry, but it's just good to know whether what plant you're dealing with. Is it a cultivar or is it a native species? So another part that little abbreviation you might see in your botanical name that might be a little confusing is an abbreviation that isn't forma, subspecies, or variety. It might be an L with a period, or it might be someone else's last name abbreviated. And what these are the author of that species. So the example here, Digitalis purpurea with a capital L period at the end of it, that means that Linnaeus was the author of this name. So he's the person that originally assigned this name to this species. So you will often see the author name at the end of the species name. And it's often Linnaeus because he named so many species when he was originally cataloging plants. But sometimes you will see someone else's initials at the end of a plant name. If I was to name a new plant, which I haven't done and probably never will, you would see Healy or abbreviation of my last name at the end of a plant name. So it's the authority of the plant. And it's just important to know that that's a possibility because it's sometimes confusing. You might think it's part of the species name, but it's actually the author of that particular species. So you do see that at the end of plant names sometimes. So another part of a plant name that you might come across in a plant catalog is a trade name. So trade names are often applied to cultivars, usually for marketing purposes. So the example at the bottom of this slide is clematis. You can see that the trade name is Blue Angel, and the reason that a trade name has been applied to this particular cultivar is because the cultivar is not in English, and it would be pretty hard to sell people that plant or even pronounce that cultivar name. So someone came up with this cultivar name, and that is the official name of this plant. However, it's not very transferable to North America, so they've given it a trade name, but they can't give it a new cultivar name because a cultivar name is like a species. It is a unique identifier for that particular plant. So rather than selling it under this name, someone will apply a trade name. So this can be done for lots of different reasons. Sometimes there's just an older cultivar that people are trying to invigorate, get on the market again. They might give it a new name just to try and sell it under a kind of a flashy new name. They might give it a new name because of a language issue. They might give it a new name because maybe they're making or putting together a series. Proven Winners is known for that, putting together a series of plants that they feel are exceptional, and then they may give that entire series a new name, a new trade name, just so that they can sell them all under one brand. So it's usually a marketing thing, but if you were to write them according to the plant code, trade names should always be in small capital letters. And you do see this in plant catalogs sometimes. If you see a designation in the plant name in small caps, that means that it's a trade name. Another reason people might do this is because it might be associated with plant breeder rights or patents, so it might allow them to patent the plant and then receive royalties for selling that plant. So lots of different reasons people apply trade names, but it doesn't replace the cultivar name. So you can see there's that cultivar names are often a little more user-friendly. So plant breeders, for example, if I was to go out and breed a whole bunch of lilies, and maybe I'm a Star Trek fan, I might call one I might call one Spock, or I might call one Captain Kirk. And you will see that cultivar names are often more user-friendly. They're names that plant breeders give to plants, so they have to give it the species name because that's the unique identifier for that species. But when you're coming up with a cultivar name, there really aren't any rules. So you can call it whatever you want. You can call it after your son, your dog, your favorite TV show, or you can give it a common name that describes the plant, which is generally how scientific names are assigned. But there's a lot less rules around cultivars. So oftentimes, even if you don't see those single quotations in the plant catalog, you can tell that it's a cultivated species just because the vernacular used for that common name is more common language than the scientific name. So the last variation of a botanical name we're going to look at here is a hybrid. So oftentimes in a plant catalog, you'll see this little X symbol. In a plant name, it can occur before the genus or after the genus. So if you're looking at a plant name that has an X before the genus, that means it's an intergeneric hybrid. So two genera have been crossed in order to create a new species. So you can see Heucherella is the most common example of this. Intergeneric hybrids are not super common because it's a fairly high level cross. So plants at the genus level are not necessarily super similar. So I always like to use, I know this is a perennial ID lecture, but I like to use evergreens as an example because I think we can all picture, say, a pine and a spruce in our minds. So crossing a pine and a spruce, they're fairly different. So genus is pretty high level. So that's what an intergeneric hybrid is. So Heucherella is a hybrid of Heuchera and Tiarella. So Heuchera is commonly used in horticulture and gardens. The genus common name is Coral Bells. So it's a plant that we use a lot. Whereas Tiarella is in the same family, but it is more of a native plant. So Tiarella cordifolia is a plant that has been used in native plantings for a long time. It has a lot more drought tolerance than the Heuchera we're used to planting in our garden spaces. So by crossing the two, you get the really nice qualities of Heuchera, really showy, really different foliage color, and you get the nice qualities of Tiarella that it can handle drought, handle a little bit more sunshine. You cross the two, you kind of get a super species. The new genus name given to this is Heucherella. So you can tell that it's a generic hybrid by that little X in front of the new genus name. And also there's also a cultivar name attached to this, Autumn Cascade. So if you see a little X symbol after the genus, so you can see in that second example there, Salvia X sylvestris, that is an interspecific hybrid. So two different salvias were crossed in order to make Salvia times sylvestris. So sylvestris is the new specific epithet. So in an intergeneric hybrid, it's given a new genus name because it's not either of the genera, so you have to come up with a new genus. And in an interspecific hybrid, it's given the same genus name because it's still salvia, because two salvias were crossed to create it, but it's given a new specific epithet, sylvestris. So in this example, you can also see that there's a cultivar name and then a trade name associated with this as well. So if you see a little X in the name, you're looking at a hybrid. So those are all the things that when you're looking at a plant name, you need to think about. So is it a species? Is it a hybrid? Is it a cultivated variety? Does it have a trade name? Is there an author name included in there, which really isn't part of the name? If you were to write it down, the formatting rules I have summarized here, species is always italicized. So genus and specific epithet, always italicized, lowercase except for the first letter. Cultivars are always in single quotations. Trade names are in small capital letters, and any of the abbreviations in a name, according to the plant names code, are not supposed to be italicized. So variety, subspecies, forma, and the hybrid symbol shouldn't be italicized. This is a really sticky point that not a lot of people stick to. I go back and forth when I'm teaching plant names in a couple courses whether or not I deduct marks for this because it's pretty sticky to make people remember that you don't have to italicize these little abbreviations. But if you're to do it properly according to the code, they should not be italicized. And author names are the same. They're not italicized and often abbreviated. So those are the formatting rules for plant names. And hopefully, if we were in class right now, I usually like to bring a selection of plant catalogs and just get people to look at them and kind of figure out what they're seeing in the catalog, what part of the name they're looking at. Pick out the native species or the wild species, pick out the cultivated species, pick out the hybrids, that type of thing. But since we can't do that here, you can have fun with that at home. I'm sure lots of us are getting plant catalogs in the mail and spending time perusing them. I know I have been. But let's look at an example together. So the highest level I think is practical when we're trying to identify plants is the family level. So if we look at the plant family for the Heuchera example that we were just talking about in the hybrid slide, the family for Heuchera and Tiarella is Saxifragaceae. Family names are easy to tell because they always end in aca. It is a standard suffix for all family names. And I like to tell a joke about this. When I first started learning about plants and I would be all excited identifying families on a walk, my husband would join in and say, oh, there's a blue flower. And he would say, oh, that's a blue ACA. And then he'd see a pink flower and say, oh, that's a pink ACA. So it's a kind of a funny example of how easy it is to know that you're talking about a family. So they always end in the suffix ACA. So family Saxifragaceae. So if we go down to the next level in the classification, we get to genus, which is Heuchera. So we talked about Heuchera, Tiarella being both in this family, Saxifragaceae. So we often communicate at the genus level in horticulture. So if we were to talk about daylilies, we're talking about Hemerocallis. So that's a genus. If we were to talk about coral bells, we're talking about Heuchera. So the common name coral bells applies to that genus. We usually refer to coral bells as kind of the whole section of cultivars you could get in a catalog that fall under that genus. So if we drill down to the next level, Heuchera micrantha is a specific species. So that is one plant. It has certain characteristics that are specific to that one species. And so the species would have a different common name. So it's a little bit more specific than coral bells. So the common name for this species is Crevice alumroot. So you can see it gives you a little bit more indication of this particular species likes to grow in cracks. So it's a little more specific than coral bells, which is really just descriptive of the inflorescence of that genus. You can go down a level further, down to a variety. So maybe there's a natural variety of this plant that grows in the wild. Heuchera micrantha variety diversifolia. So getting a little bit more specific. And then someone got their hands on this variety and decided it was really nice and decided to maybe choose a selection of it or breed it and come up with a nice cultivar, and they name that cultivar Absi. So you can see that that's really not it's kind of a more common word in the single quotations. And then someone decided that this wasn't very descriptive of that plant. Maybe it wasn't a good name to sell it in the market. They wanted to give it something a little more flashy that maybe was more descriptive of the foliage, and they gave it a trade name called Bressingham Bronze. So you can kind of see how all of those components of the name work by looking at this example. So I would recommend taking a look at a couple plant catalogs and seeing if you can pull out these different things. Can you find the genus common name? Can you find the species common name? Can you tell the difference? Can you find a cultivar name? Can you find any trade names? And depending on the catalog, you will see examples of all these different things. So a bit of practice is always good. So what do plant names mean? Let's look a little bit at the Latin that is used in our scientific names. So as much as they don't seem descriptive to us, if we knew Latin, they would be. And this is just something that you can get really nice little pocket books that kind of have a list of all the Latin terms and their meaning in Latin. And it can be really helpful when you're trying to identify different species because they are descriptive of what that plant looks like. So they often describe shape. So this is a long list of, actually it's a pretty short list of some of the terms that describe different shapes that we see in our plants. So if a plant name has the word gracilis in it, it has kind of a graceful form when you look at it. Sagittaria means arrow-headed, so that's usually referring to the shape of a leaf. Same thing with lanceolata and rotundus and flabulatus, palmatus, longiflorus. Usually all of those terms describe the shape of the leaf. So is it pointed like an arrow? Does it look more like a sword? Is it a round leaf? Is it fan-shaped? Does it look like a hand having kind of a central point where all of the leaflets are attached? Fistulosus is usually more descriptive of a flower. So usually a tubular flower. So something like a honeysuckle would have a more tubular flower. So oftentimes these terms are usually the specific epithet of a name, more so than a genus, and they're really descriptive of what that species looks like. So a couple examples here, Ligularia dentata. So dentata means toothed, and if you were to zoom in on the edges of these giant leaves, you would see little tooths along the edges of those leaves. So it is descriptive of the name, and it can be very helpful. So if you know you're looking at a Ligularia because you can recognize that genus at a high level, you know that they usually have this form where they have kind of a basal rosette of leaves. The leaves are usually large. They usually grow in a wet environment. You'll kind of think, oh, that's probably a Ligularia, but what species is it? If you know that dentata means toothed and you look at them and a number of them don't have toothed edges, then you'll know that that's the right species. So Darmera peltata, you can see has a shield-shaped leaf. So again, it can be really helpful just as a kind of a one-off if you're out in the field to be able to identify, especially in the horticulture industry, we're usually looking at, maybe we're in a yard and there's only a handful of Ligularias to look at. And so just knowing what the meaning of that Latin word is can sometimes help just pick out the one that we're looking for pretty quickly. They can also refer to color. So there's lots and lots of different words for different colors. You can see here Argentea silver, Azura sky blue. Some of them are a little less intuitive, like Ceruleum, the color of the Mediterranean Sea at noon. I don't know about you, but I haven't seen the Mediterranean Sea at noon, not yet anyway. But I imagine that to be kind of like a bluey green color. You can see red, purple, black, golden, green. Some of them are a little, like, talk about variegation. So variegatus is pretty intuitive to us because we use that term commonly. 2 or more colors. Striatus means streaked, pallidus means pale. Punctata means spotted. So again, these can be really helpful if you're looking at a plant. Often color is associated with the color of the flower of a plant, but sometimes it is leaf descriptive of the leaves, especially when you get down into spotted, streaked, pale, those type of terminology. So a couple examples of botanical names that are descriptive of the color. So Thalictrum flavum, subspecies glaucum. So there's two descriptors here. So flavum is Latin for yellow. So you can see the yellow bloom. And glaucum is kind of like a gray foliage. So it looks like there's kind of a powder, a gray powder on the foliage. So you can see that there's two descriptive characteristics of this plant. So you could probably tell some thalictrums apart, especially if they're in flower, based on knowing the color meaning of their Latin name. Another example, Thalictrum aquilegifolium. So you can see, well, for this example, you need to know what the leaves of Aquilegia look like, which can be another level of complication. But this species was given this name because it looks very much like Aquilegia, which is a separate genus. But for those of you that are familiar with Aquilegia, you can look at the leaves and say, yeah, that's definitely looks like Aquilegia. So you can see these two thalictrums might be really hard to tell apart if you didn't know the meaning of their scientific names. So sometimes it's as simple as that, just knowing a few basic terms or carrying around a little book that defines the Latin. If you're trying to tell two thalictrums apart and you have a list to start with, you can easily tell them apart just by defining the words in their name. So people are always scared to say plant names, including myself. I've gotten over it at this point, but there was a time when I was terrified to say the name of any plant to anyone who had been working in the industry, because it's kind of embarrassing to pronounce something incorrectly. And I had some great advice from a boss that I had at one point, and she would just tell me to say that's how they say it in a different country and just sound confident and carry on. And ever since I had that advice, that's what I've been doing. And no one's ever going to call you on it because no one has any idea how to pronounce them. So that's my advice to you. Just sound confident and go for it. But I'll talk about a few tips here that might help you have a little more confidence in pronouncing botanical names. So first we'll talk about the gender of a name. So in the Latin language, words can be male, female, or neutral. And certain endings tell us which one it is. So names ending in US, ER are male, names ending in A, RA, RIS are female, and then UM is usually a neutral name. And this really isn't important for any reason except that when you see a plant name that has alpinus as the specific epithet, alpina or alpinum. So the examples here are Dianthus alpinus, Veronica alpina, Epimedium alpinum. They look like three different words, but really they're just different sexes. So male, female, and neutral, they all mean alpine. So it's just kind of a note to self. If you see any variation of the specific epithet like this, it doesn't have a different meaning. They all mean alpine. It's just either male, female, or neutral. So just something to keep in mind when you're reading plant names, because it can sometimes be confusing. Is this a misspelling? Should it be alpinum? Should it be alpinus? Why is it spelled differently? That's why, because Latin has gender. So how do you say it? How do you pronounce it? We don't speak Latin anymore. So it's not something that we have on the tip of our tongue. We don't know how to pronounce the vowels. It's pronounced differently in UK and North America and the rest of the world. So we'll just look at a couple of the ways that vowels are pronounced and why it's different. So in the US, we usually say clematis. That's how I would say clematis. But if you were talking to someone from England about this plant, they would say clematis. And the reason for that is they just put the emphasis on a different part of the word because the vowel is either long or short. So in the US, we tend to pronounce vowels long, so clematis, whereas in England, vowels are pronounced short. So you would say clematis, which changes the emphasis of the parts of the word. So you're not wrong. If you say clematis or clematis or clematis, it's all right. It just depends where you are in the world. So don't be shy. So let's just talk. This is kind of a long list of things to read on a slide, but they're just a couple tips for pronunciation. So always pronounce all the syllables. So just read it out as it's like, sound it out, just like we did in grade school. That's kind of the trick. All of the syllables of botanical names are generally pronounced. Oftentimes it's a person's name, and if it is a person's name, it doesn't change because it's Latin in a plant name. Just say it like you would say the person's name. J is usually pronounced hard. So if you see juncus, it's juncus. It's not a soft J there. OE is usually pronounced E. So Ipomia, sweet potato vine, that's how you would say that, Ipomia. So it's kind of a strange vowel combination that we don't often see that you might question how to pronounce. So it's usually pronounced E. V is pronounced very soft, so verbascum, not verbascum. AE is usually pronounced like meat. So again, a different combination. We usually see EA in the English language, whereas you see AE in Latin often. PH is pronounced like an F. So euphorbia, that's something that is a little more common to us. And AU is pronounced like ah, so as in crawl. So acaulis is how you would pronounce that. And you often see that as a specific epithet in plant names. So just a few tips on pronunciation to keep in mind. It's kind of a short list, but it goes a long way. You'll see these vowel combinations in many of the plant names that you encounter. So we're getting close to the end of the webinar this morning, and I just want to finish off by talking about plant families. So like I said, if I was to continue on with a series of perennial plant identification lectures, the way I usually do it is I'd pick a particular family and focus on that family, and we would learn all the perennials in that family. So this is kind of an introduction to that format. So plant families are plants that all have common characteristics. So like the Brady Bunch, all of them had hair of gold like their mom. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about plant families. No different than a large family of humans. So they have very similar morphological characteristics. We talked a little bit about that. So this absolutely does mean the way the leaves are arranged on the stem. Oftentimes it's the shape of the leaves. Oftentimes it's the way the flowers are arranged. So we saw in a lot of those daisies, those central flowers and the showy flowers around the edges, those are all in the Asteraceae family. And it's very easy to tell something's in the Asteraceae family because that is very distinctive floral structure. And generally speaking, you have to get down to the reproductive parts of a plant in order to put them in the appropriate family. So usually leaves and stems are not enough. So oftentimes someone will come into a garden center with a leaf of a plant and they'll say, "What is this?" And the answer is you're not sure. And you can maybe get it down to genus level, but getting a species identification with just a leaf is nearly impossible. So you have to kind of look at the nitty-gritty of the inside of the flowers. So I'm just going to give a few examples here of plant families and the characteristics that we would use to tell them apart. So Apiaceae is a plant family that we come across a lot when we're talking about perennials. A common name for that family is the parsley family. So they're all herbaceous plants, meaning there's no woody plants in this family. They're all perennial. They all have small flowers in umbels. So you can see in the top corner of that slide what an umbel looks like. So I'm sure we're all familiar with, we can probably think of a plant that we've seen with that flower structure. So all the plants in this family have that flower structure. So it's really easy. You can kind of do a quick walk by and say, okay, that's in the Apiaceae family, that's in the Apiaceae family right away. If you were to look really, really closely at all the individual florets in that flower, you would see that they have parts in fives. So 5 petals, stamens, calyx. So there's everything that's in that flower is in parts of 5. Their fruit has 2 parts. So some of these terms might not be super familiar, but a dehiscent carpel means that if you think of a fennel seed, if you were to break it in half, those are the 2 dehiscent carpels. So dehiscent just means dry, meaning that it'll break apart when it's dry, and carpels is just compartments for seeds. So with the fruit of all of the plants in this family is going to break into 2 parts like that. And then finally, we get down to leaves. So like I said, this isn't necessarily as descriptive of the plant family because it can be common across many families, but all the leaves in this family are alternate. So if you were to look at them on the stem, they wouldn't be right across from each other. They would be staggered along that stem. They're compound. So if you can think about a kind of a, again, I'll use a tree example because they're kind of easy to picture, but if you think about a maple leaf, that's a simple leaf. It's not a compound, whereas a honey locust has all those tiny little leaflets. That would be a compound leaf. So the leaves in this family are compound, and they usually have a sheathing base. So let's look at a few examples because it's kind of hard to picture these things. So this is a picture of celery, and the reason I've included this one, it is in the Apiaceae family. The species name for celery is Apium graveolens, and the part that we eat of celery is actually the leaf petiole. So the petiole is the attached, you can see that the leaves would kind of be at the top of this celery, which have been cut off, and this long appendage is what would attach it to the stem of the plant. Now, obviously, this is a cultivated plant. It's been cultivated for a long time, and it is very much so not in its natural form anymore. But that really is what we're eating when we're eating a piece of celery, is a gigantic leaf petiole. So if you think of a maple leaf and that stem on that leaf that attaches it to the tree, that's also a petiole. So celery is kind of a grotesque version of that. But you can see, the reason I like to show this example is at the bottom of this, you can see that sheathing base. So the petiole of all the leaves that attach in the Apiaceae family have this characteristic. So they have this base that gets wider at the bottom and attaches. So it's a sheathing base, and that's very distinctive of plants in this family. So if you see an umbel flower and you see a sheathing base, you can be pretty sure that you're looking at something in the Apiaceae family. So this is a picture of dill, Anethium graveolens, and you can see kind of at a much smaller scale, an example of this. So you can see the umbel flowers, and you can see that you can't actually see leaves in this picture. So I'm sorry, that's not a great example of the sheathing base, but if we were to see leaves, it would have that sheathing base. So another plant in the Apiaceae family, Golden Alexander or Zizia aurea. So you can see here again the umbel inflorescence and the sheathing base. These leaves, again, I don't have a good picture of a sheathing base except for celery, but these leaves would have that sheathing base at the base of the three leaflets here in this picture. So a couple examples of plants in the Apiaceae family, and it's so easy to tell them apart. I'm sure you can go out in your gardens and find a few examples that belong in that plant family, just from those few characteristics, just knowing a couple things about that family. And from there, it's a lot easier to narrow down the genus and species that you're looking at. So another example of a plant family that we commonly use when we're talking about perennials is Brassicaceae, plants in the mustard family. Similar to Apiaceae, all herbaceous, no woody plants in this family. They're very pungent plants, but not poisonous. So you can probably imagine that by the common name of the family. Mustard is kind of a pungent flavor and smell. Flowers are in racemes or corymbs. So I have a picture of the inflorescence in the top corner of this slide as well. So a raceme is much different than an umbel. So it does have many flowers in the inflorescence, but they're kind of spaced out like this, right across from each other, kind of a long, tall inflorescence. So a corymb is kind of a compressed version of this, where all of the flowers would have the same height. So it would, if you can just imagine that raceme being kind of condensed and all the florets being along the top. So it's kind of a flat topped raceme. And if you were to get out your microscope and look really closely at all of the flowers in the mustard family, they would all have 4 petals, 4 sepals, and then the sexual parts, there would be 4 long and 2 short stamens in that flower. Their fruit is a silique or silicle, which is a fancy word for a long cylindrical type of fruit. And their leaves are alternate with no stipules. So the leaves would be arranged along the stem, staggered, not right across from each other. And stipules are, you can kind of see in this picture, this is not a picture of a mustard inflorescence. It's just an example of a raceme. So you can see stipules in this picture. So these tiny little green appendages at the base of every flower are known as stipules. So some plant families have these and some don't. So the mustard family does not have these. So a couple examples of plants in the mustard family. I think the easiest characteristic to recognize if you're looking at something in flower and something not in fruit of the mustard family is petals in 4. So you can really see that in this example. So rock cress, Arabis alpina, you can see here petals in 4. Radish, Raphanus sativus is, again, you can really see the petals in four, and you can really see the male part sticking out of this flower, and that's often characteristic of a plant in the mustard family. They're not hidden, they stick right out between those four petals. Dame's rocket, so again, you can really see those four petals. Parts in four is fairly distinctive of something in the mustard family. A lot of other families have flower parts in 3, 5, or kind of numerous. So four is very distinctive of the mustard family. And you can really see the example of the raceme inflorescence with this Dame's rocket here. So you can kind of see that long inflorescence with flowers across from each other along the stem. So the final family we're going to look at before we finish up today is the legume family. And these are very recognizable plants. Very large family, includes both perennials and woody plants. Their sexual parts are kind of funny. They're all kind of tied together in this tube-like structure that you'll see in the top corner there. There's 10 male parts all kind of together with one kind of separate. It's kind of a funny arrangement. Their flowers look like butterflies, so they are bilaterally symmetrical, so you can kind of cut them down the middle and they're the same on both sides. The fruit of a legume is dehiscent, so that means when it's mature, it opens up and the seeds fall out. It doesn't stay closed. The leaves are alternate, and in contrast to the mustard family, they do have stipules at the bottom of their leaves. But you can see in this family, the leaves are really not indicative of a legume because they can either be simple or compound, which is really not helpful at all. So you really need to know what the flowers look like when you're trying to identify a legume. And luckily, they're very distinctive. So you can see this butterfly shape. If you look at a few pictures here, you'll be able to pick it out very easily in the landscape. So you can see here on this broom, Genista tinctoria, if you were to cut this flower down the middle, it would be the same on both sides, very butterfly-esque. And you can kind of see the legumes, the pods on this picture too. They're kind of fuzzy, kind of immature there, but that's typical of a legume fruit. A pod that, when mature, will open up and let the seeds out. So lupin is another example in the legume family, and you can, again, identify this butterfly form of the flower very easily if you were to cut that in half, same on both sides. Bush clover, again, that butterfly flower is very easy to see. And if you were to look at the leaves, I don't think I included the leaves in the lupin. You can kind of see them in the background there, but they're very different than the leaves of a bush clover. So you can see how leaves are not a reliable characteristic for identifying plants always. But the flowers, very, very distinctive. So that's another thing that's really important about plant ID is the time of year that you're identifying plants. Sometimes you just have to say to people, I can't identify that right now, or I need the flower. I just don't have enough information in order to identify that. So that's the end of this morning's lecture. It is a very complicated topic, plant ID, but if you kind of have that base knowledge of how plant names are applied and then start recognizing the characteristics of a plant family, once we have that kind of mastered, you can start delving into individual species and picking out those characteristics that uniquely identify that species. So I'd be really happy to answer any questions anyone has this morning, if there are any for me.
All right. So we do have a few questions here.
Okay.
Let me just go back. Okay, so the first one is there a system for identifying plants that are native to one region that has been popularized by, I don't know how to say the right word, but Anchor? Or will the native classification transfer to the new region?
Okay, I'm just trying to find that question because I didn't quite catch that word that you said.
Anther?
Well, let me see if I can answer. So if you were to look at a website called the Flora of North America, it catalogs all of the plants that are native to North America. And they have a lot of tools on there where you can look at the different genera that are native in our area and then drill down within each plant family, all the different genera and all the different species that are native to North America. So that's the best resource I've come across for looking at native plants and figuring out which is which. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but maybe they can tell us if they have further questions.
All right. Okay, so the next one is what is the best book or source to find information on toxic plants?
Toxic plants. I don't have an answer for that. I I I don't have one of those on hand that I've used as a reference, but I can look it up and pass it along if you like, Carrie.
Perfect. Sounds great. And is there a classification system based upon evolutionary trait?
So that's a really good question. So basically, that's how all plants have been assigned or have evolved. So their morphology evolved, and that is kind of what's used to give them their names. So it's not technically based on evolution, it's based on what they look like. But what they look like is a result of evolution. So, in a kind of backwards way, it's definitely evolutionary based, but it's always based on morphological trait or their DNA code.
Okay, perfect. Are there any plant catalogs that you could recommend online? And if so, if you have those, I could also include those in the email that I send out later on.
For learning plant names, I always like to use Sheridan Nurseries and William Dam as examples. Those are kind of my favorites because there's a lot of the things I talk about you'll be able to find in those two plant catalogs.
Okay, perfect. And then another one is I have a book called Botany in a Day by Thomas Pels. Is that still an accurate resource?
Mostly, yes.
Yes,
I would
okay.
say, yeah, it's a good resource for sure. It's kind of an excellent way, and kind of an easier read for sure.
Okay, perfect. And then what was the native species resource again?
So if you want to there's some tools called plant keys, which I didn't really get into this in this lecture, but they're kind of a way to identify a native species using, like, you have different choices. Does it have this type of leaf or this type of leaf? Yes or no? And you can kind of drill down from there. So there's a lot of plant keys for native species on Flora of North America. But there's also a really good horticultural plant key that I should pass along to the group. So I will give you those two links, Carrie, and you can send them out to the attendees.
Perfect. Sounds great. Are plant identification apps a good tool to use?
I don't think so. I've really taught a lot of plant ID lectures, and I get asked that all the time, and I've spent a lot of time playing with them because I want to use them because it's easy, and it's easy for me, it's easy for them, it's easy for people to use, but they're really not accurate enough. Because oftentimes and now saying that, like, it depends what you're trying to identify. If you're looking at identifying some super common species, like a cultivar that's really showy and like really distinctive, you might have success with it. But I don't find like, if you were in a garden with hundreds of species, the chances of you getting it right with an app is very slim. And you just need someone to check it. So I just don't have a lot of confidence in it, even though you often do. You will get the right species sometimes, but not always. And you can never use leaves. Leaves are just not reliable, especially for perennials. I find that the ones that are accurate, they're more accurate when it comes to evergreens and trees. But for perennials, they're fairly useless.
Okay, perfect. Any examples of when a hybrid species messed up the ecosystem dynamics? Did any turn invasive?
I think the opposite. I have read the opposite. So what happens is the population won't be very resilient anymore. But there might be examples of that, but I'm not entirely sure.
All right, perfect. And that looks like that's all the questions there. If anybody does have any other questions, I can pass those along to you as well, Jodi.
Okay.
But thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to everybody else that was on the call today. We will be sending this out in a recording along with the PowerPoint and a couple of the resource links that Jodi's talked about today. For any other webinars that we have coming up, please feel free to check them out on horttrades.com. Thank you so much, everyone, and we will see you all later.
Thank
Stay
you,
safe.
everyone.
Bye.